Thank you all for coming to our special One Health doubleheader and our first session of the Cornell K Center for Wildlife Health Distinguished Speakers Series. I'm going to start off by just, for those of you who don't know, giving you a quick overview of the Center for Wildlife Health. And then I'm going to have our first speaker introduced. But for those of you who don't know us, the vision for the Cornell K Center for Wildlife Health really is about a healthy future for wildlife, people, and planet. And our mission is about transforming science into impact through discovery, engagement, education, and policy to ensure a healthy future for wildlife and the environment that supports all of us. And why do we do this? Because we need nature, and now nature needs us. And what do I mean by that? We need nature, we need biodiversity for all of the life-sustaining things that it provides, from clean air to clean water to nutritious foods and climate mitigation. But when I say that nature needs us, I often get pushback. People say, oh, nature will be just fine. Nature needs us to be more mindful stewards. Nature needs us to think about using natural resources in a sustainable way, not mine it, but think about it as natural capital in the bank that we live off of the interest of, so that future generations can continue to benefit. That's really important in terms of a sustainable future. All the work that we do at the center, which covers now almost 30 faculty, staff, more students, postdocs, et cetera, we sort of have four pillars that capture our work. We respond to the health threats to the survival of key species around the world. Many of us focus on policy. We provide landscape level guidance on wildlife compatible policy and practice in the land use realm. Many of us work to minimize disease transfer at that interface between wildlife, livestock, and people. I'm sure you're all familiar with the One Health paradigm. It's really an approach that recognizes those interrelationships, the fact that the health of animals, wild and domestic, and ourselves and the environment are all inextricably linked. But all those three pillars really roll up into this last pillar, which I describe as building new constituencies for wildlife conservation. What I mean by that is many of us who work in conservation, our first interface, whether it's in New York or Southern Africa or Nepal, we're often working with departments of wildlife or ministries of environment, and that's critical. But where we can really have leverage is if we can make biodiversity conservation relevant to broader constituencies, to people who are interested in agriculture, public health. So if I get to convince a minister of agriculture or a minister of public health, or ideally a minister of finance, that conservation is in their best interest, that's when we can really impact change. And so we're trying to use the One Health approach to broaden awareness about the relevance of conservation to all of these sectors. I want to now just tell you a little bit about why we thought it was important to have a distinguished speakers series. We think, we are a relatively small community in wildlife health, but I think we punch above our weight. And we wanted to share some of the best expertise in the world with the Cornell community. And I couldn't be more excited than to have the colleagues we have presenting to you today. We chose Dr. Craig Stephen and Dr. Marcela Uhart because they really represent the best of the best in terms of moving science to policy and action through that One Health lens. They are friends, colleagues, and really thought leaders for many, many years, and I'm just thrilled that we have them. So that's the good news. We have just a little bit of bad news, but we've made amends. Dr. Stephen is going to be joining us on Zoom. He had some family issues. He couldn't travel, and it's not just because he's in Canada and we're here. Nothing to do with it. But we're thrilled that Craig was able to accommodate us. So we're going to be introducing Dr. Stephen first. I'm going to bring on Dr. Kristen Schuler, who is the director of the Cornell Wildlife Health Lab, here to introduce Dr. Stephen. Kristen.
All right. Thank you, Steve. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Craig Stephen. He is one of those people that, you always look to have these sort of mentors or these people that you really just they just get exactly what you've been thinking about, but can't quite distill it in your brain to the words that you want to say. And I feel like Craig does that very, very well. So just a little background on Craig. He is a veterinary epidemiologist who's worked around the globe, really, for the last 30 years. So that gives him a lot of time to make it to a lot of places. He started his career as a rural veterinary practitioner with a DVM degree from Western College of Veterinary Medicine. He did his doctoral research in infectious diseases at the University of Saskatchewan. So really, he was doing One Health before One Health was even really a thing. And I think one of the things that I enjoy most about how he thinks about these ideas is that he talks about resilience, and he brings together ideas from public health and wildlife health and merges those together. He has a very distinguished resume as far as his background, being the CEO of the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. He's led other NGOs, and now he is at the executive director of the McEachran Institute. So I won't eat up any more of his time, but please take it away, Craig.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation and for the introduction, the kind introduction. I very appreciate Steve and Kristen getting me down to talk to you, well, at least virtually getting down. And I do apologize for not making it in person. So I want to talk to you a little bit about sort of what I've learned over those past 30 years about how to navigate my way through this messy world that we're in right now. Because there's many, many days where I just want to quit, because it just seems to be too much and too hard and too challenging. And I want to try to maybe share with you some ways that I've learned to maybe make a difference and move some of what we know into action. So first, future readiness first. What do I mean by that, right? So there's the official definition: the ability to anticipate and adapt to upcoming changes and disruptions by developing the necessary skills and knowledge to thrive in an uncertain future. Now, when I was making this slide, I was trying to get a picture that was, futuristic looking. I picked this one from the Blade Runner movie that was made in 1982. And this is what they thought 2019 was going to look like. So it tells you that maybe we're not that great at predicting what's going to happen next. And we've always been apocalyptic as a species. You can go back to ancient Rome, where they were saying, and it was too polluted, we weren't going to make it. And the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom, when that happened, they said 50 years and the world was going to end because it was so polluted. So we've always had these cries of apocalyptic problems, and we've always had these great predictions. We're going to have robot maids by now, all these sorts of things. So it's difficult to know what's coming. But I think we can all agree that there are some concerning trends of a mess ahead of us. And some of those worrying trends, if we look at our planetary boundaries and how we're exceeding them. So these are things that people feel we must have to survive as a globe and as a species. Issues like climate change and biosphere integrity, land systems, water use, novel issues, ozone, all those sorts of things. And each time they assess these, we're seeing that more boundaries are being crossed. The last assessment in 2023, we've already crossed 6 of the boundaries that are sustainable, that we need to keep life going. And the other ones haven't all been assessed. And you look at that, where I put that star there, one of the things that we've got is more novel entities. The world's changing with new things that we weren't really anticipating or expecting or thought we had under control. And there's big effects from that you all know about. Extinctions on the rise, climate change is happening, pollution's going unabated, and costs of healthcare are escalating. So we're in times of unprecedented social and environmental change right now. And that's created our new reality. So they talk about having a VUCA world and a BANI outcome, right? So we're in a more volatile environment right now. And we have to react more quickly to all these changes that are happening, often unpredictably and out of our control. Because of this complexity and interactions and combinations, things are getting more uncertain. Part of the uncertainty comes from complexity, social complexity, ecological complexity, and the interaction of those two, because there's many, many dynamic interdependencies. And finally, we have ambiguity. The world we're in right now is not kind of how we thought it was supposed to work. And often, things that are affecting it are outside of our worldview or our expertise. And that creates this experience of the world being more brittle. When we cross those margins, things break easier. We become more anxious because it is uncertain, it is ambiguous. We don't like that. We've recognized that it's not a linear world like much of our science used to teach us. It's a complex world. And despite having more and more and more information, it seems the world's getting more incomprehensible. There's a few things that are driving this new reality, and I like to call it the excess of C's. First, change is happening too fast. We are in unprecedented environmental and social change times right now. We've always been a connected world, but we're more connected than we realized. Whether that's politically, economically, ecologically, there are interconnected and interdependent problems and solutions. Now, we're not good at dealing with that. We're good in science of taking a problem and isolating it and dealing with that. So we're not very good at dealing with connectivity. Our capacity to deal with this is shrinking fast, as we see with these planetary boundaries, as we see with species disappearance, as we see with instability and uncertainty. Confusion is increasing. Even though we have this constant access to information, it's conflicting and it's diverse and its values are even more diverse. So just getting more information hasn't made the world clearer for us to understand. I think the final C is confidence. I think we still have too much confidence that tomorrow is going to be like yesterday, that we can easily predict what's going on, and business as usual will work. We just do it better. We just know more. And the causes of those causes is first the word that I want to get in the dictionary, interproblemarinarity. Made up that word a while ago. So let me explain that, right? Most of what we do now, even in the One Health world, is let's take this problem and look at it in an interdisciplinary fashion. Well, an anthropologist and a veterinarian and a physician and an economist will solve this problem. But nothing in the world experiences one problem in isolation or has only one health asset in isolation. We're in a world where problems interact and depend with each other. And so we don't study it that way. We've never really studied health as experienced by any living thing. I'll go look at Japanese encephalitis. I'm not going to deal with the pollution issue or the overexploitation issue. So interproblemarinarity is underappreciated, and that's one of the causes of those causes. The other problem we have is deficit thinking. Science is often about refutation, getting more information, getting to understand that problem better and better and better. We spend more time trying to figure out the problem in more detail than trying to figure out our solutions. And we get much more investment in finding risks rather than protecting assets to keep us well. Finally, I think the other thing we have to confront is what I call expert exceptionalism. In other words, well, we shouldn't do anything till I know what's going on. I see this every time I go to a problem. What do we need to do about this problem? Research and education. We need to learn more and tell more. But it has to be what I think is true. And that's created this idea of experts coming in saying, I'm here to help, rather than experts coming in and say, how can we help in this situation? We have to have this truth and certainty before we actually help anything. The other problem is the disease I've discovered, well, really a disease I made up, collective global amnesia. And the symptoms of collective global amnesia are that we recognize a new potentially catastrophic threat. We react to it, we pour money into it, people do a PhD on it, and then we move on. I mean, when I went to university, we were all going to die of nuclear war and chemical pollution. Boy, go to the Wildlife Disease Association meeting in a few months, there'll be hardly anything on pollution anymore. When I first started in this business, it was all about pollution. But the world's no less polluted. The nuclear threat's no different, but we habituate and we move on. And that means our recall of the past events starts to vanish, and we don't really remember how we got there. We're already seeing that in response to COVID in some circles. And so one problem replaces another problem in either popular or political attention, even though the preceding problem is still looming over us. We never get back to the root causes that make things healthier and safer. Health isn't sexy, disease is. All right, so how do we navigate this reality? That's where I'm trying to share some of my insights that have informed how I practice now. And this is kind of Craig's journey through his career, not necessarily in chronological order. So those of you who know me will know I'm sort of playing a bit fast and loose in how things happen. But let me just take you through that. So as Chris said, I started as a rural mixed animal veterinarian. This is one of the farms out in Vancouver Island where I practiced in British Columbia. All species, a lot of wildlife, and it was great as a young vet. There was no board certified specialist anywhere. I did orthopedic surgery, I did cardiology, I did eagles, I did cows, and things got better and it was fun and you fix these things. And after a while I'm going, but they keep coming through the door. They keep coming through the door. And especially for wildlife, I like wildlife. It's remarkable. Don't get me wrong. It's remarkable to fix up an eagle. Get that wing to heal and let it go and see it fly away. but I kept having him come back, and I kept putting him back into environments that wasn't good for them. And this was starting to bother me more and more and more in practice when I realized that this endless stream of diseases is not going to stop by me just treating sick things and attacking those proximal immediate risk factors. Certainly herd health sort of taught me that thinking. And how do I think about that more broadly beyond the individual case? So around that time when I was feeling rather unsettled about where I go in my career, I got this letter saying, Craig, would you like to come back to school and do a PhD? It wasn't even on my mind. I was buying into the practice at that time. And I thought, well, maybe this will actually give me an opportunity to think about wildlife health more broadly, to think about moving beyond those proximal risk factors. I always say my career has been taking one step away from the cow side, right? I've taught as a veterinarian to have my hands on the animal. Then maybe as herd health, I look at the rest of the herd. But then maybe I have to step back and look at the farm. Then I have to look at the field. And then I have to look at the valley. And so I wanted to figure out a way to do that. But it's hard to do that with wildlife. And around that time, salmon farming was starting where I was practicing in Vancouver Island. And suddenly you have these microcosms of 5,000 to 10,000 native species living in their natural, in quotes, environment with a fence keeping them in there, where you could actually look at them. You could have 12 replicates on one site. You could start to study these sorts of things from more of a systems perspective. So there was a disease that happened then called plasmacytoid leukemia that was said to be causing 90% mortality in affected farms and spreading rapidly throughout the coast. So I thought this would be a very interesting way to start thinking about a brand new disease, thinking about being it when it's just starting and understanding these sort of quasi-contained wild populations. So like all the vets, I would go out there. You would get slow-swimming morbid fish at the top to do your samples on, because the pathologists don't want dead fish, because dead fish autolyze too quickly, they'd say, and a sick fish is a dead fish. So, you start studying those fish and you start looking at epidemiological patterns. And I was thinking I was a smart guy here, figuring out this and that and describing the epidemiology. Then an old epidemiological mentor of mine said to me, Craig, have you gone scuba diving in the pens yet? I said, well, no, John, none of the vets go scuba diving. You get your samples from the sick fish, you send it to the pathologist, you get your sample. I said, isn't that like trying to understand the diseases of cows by never walking into their barn? What the heck's he talking about? I said, well, he's right. When I was in practice, I learned so much by going into the barn and understanding the ventilation and the animal movement and their relationships. So I started scuba diving. And I spent hours in the pens just looking and watching, understanding the relationships of the fish to each other and to their environment, understanding the relationship of non-sick fish to sick fish. I spent time talking to the farmers about how they affect their decisions and the management of these animals and how their water and environmental quality are affecting things. And by doing that, I was able to design some experiments that showed that this never caused more than 10% mortality. It actually wasn't spreading. And in fact, it probably wasn't a new disease. Had I not literally immersed myself into that context of that population, I would never have understood how health and disease behave. You've got to understand your population before you understand their health and disease. And to do that, you've got to understand the environmental, the social, all these factors that affect them. So I started to get this reputation of this guy who was working on marine stuff that was starting to think about health ecologically. And I got invited to a meeting to describe a project or to develop a project to look at the ecosystem health of the Strait of Georgia. So in this picture here, you can see at the bottom is the west coast of Washington State. Up above is Vancouver Island. Above the L there, that's sort of the Strait of Georgia. So it's a body of water. And at this meeting, people are having all these great things, talking about indicators and blah, 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 all those sorts of things, right? And one person said, well, where are the boundaries? Where are the boundaries on the Strait of Georgia? You got to know your patient, right? So the physical oceanographer said, well, look, if we go from this seamount to that ridge, that's how we define it. And the chemical oceanographer said, oh, no. It's based on this salinity and this thermocline and this halocline. And the biological oceanographer said, no. It's based on the herring go here and the dolphins go there. Finally, there was the one old person in the back who'd been doing this for years. She said, look, an ecosystem is just all the things that affect the thing you're interested in. And I remember sitting in the back of that room going, I'm interested in health. So it's just a couple of years after I finished my PhD, right? And I reckon I went back to that lesson in those fish farms and went, I had to understand. I mean, I learned that lesson by saying, you can't understand that disease without understanding the things that affect the things that you're interested in. And I'd done that for disease, but now I wanted to do it for health, which made me have to think about, what do I mean by health? Right? Look, when I went to vet school, fundamentally you're taught to be a disease service specialist, an MD, a DVM. That's what you're trained to do. And so de facto, I was taught that health is the absence of disease. Right? I make an animal unsick, ergo it's healthy. Right? Same with welfare. I mean, if there's no cruelty, we're dealing with welfare. But in practice, I saw healthy cows, nothing wrong with them physically, but they were suboptimally produced, they got culled. Well, they weren't unhealthy, but it wasn't good for herd health. I saw captive animals like in aquariums, where you'd have a whale like this, where the vets would take blood samples, physical exam, they track the food, they track the behavior, and say these animals are perfectly healthy. And there's no way that animal could fulfill its needs to meet its ecological destiny, for example, and its life's roles. And I saw many cases with wild populations, with a very vibrant, thriving, even exponentially growing populations with severely sick individuals, particularly around pollution. Harbor seals, for example, in the Strait of Georgia, highly, highly polluted animals that have exponentially growing populations. So I had to think this disease-based approach to health wasn't right. So around this time, the veterinary community was starting to talk about, maybe we should adopt this definition from the World Health Organization, where health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Well, I really like that because, health is not just the absence of disease. And I started thinking about this, and I thought, I've never been completely physically, mentally, and socially well. I mean, sure wasn't when I was a student, right? Stressed out, not enough money, living in a crap place, right? Not getting exercise, not eating right. And this was one of the problems, is by saying you're not healthy until you have a complete state of that, fundamentally, you've made everybody not healthy. And this was a huge problem on human health, where they started to make everything that wasn't complete a new condition, a new diagnosis. And it really overlooked the ability of people who can meet their goals for life but still be chronically ill. Those two things led to biases. Well, you have this. And once you're labeled as that, you're now treated differently. And then we've got this problem that well-being is still subjective, and who decides where well-being lies? So this model didn't really do it for me. I couldn't take that and move that not only to the human perspective, because by this time I'm now working in human public health and as an infectious disease epidemiologist, but I can't take it back to the animals I still was interested in, particularly wild animals. So, it was at this time I realized that health is not real. In other words, a broken leg, you can see on an x-ray, you can see the anatomy disrupted, you can see that problem. Health is a social construct. We decide if that whale's healthy or not. We decide how many sea lice can be on that salmon. Down below that, salmon fisheries in Oceans Canada define a salmon population as healthy is if there's enough for us to kill. In other words, it's a sustainable fishery. Biomedical data, I realized, didn't decide what health was. People do. That was a fundamental shift in my mind, that I wasn't looking for a universal truth of health. I was looking for outcomes, performance, and indicators that met the expectations we have for those animals or people. So here's where I landed on my idea of what health is, right? Which is really just stolen from the human population health definition. Anything, whether it's a sea star, whether it's a moose, whether it's you, needs these things to be healthy. You have to access your needs for daily living. Food, water, and physical security. Everything needs that. If you don't have that, nothing else matters. You have to be able to cope with and adapt to stresses and changes. Now, that might come from physiological capacities, biodiversity. It could come from impacts of diseases. It could come back from like a farm, having money in the bank as a farmer. You need some money in the bank to deal with copes and stresses. It might be habitat for wildlife. But you have to be able to cope with the harms that come at you, a disease or extreme weather. You have to manage your vulnerabilities. So how you're exposed to risks and your sensitivity to them. You have to be able to bounce back, have some adaptive capacity. If you don't have that, you can't be healthy. Finally, you have to meet expectations. So for animals, we often talk about things like sustainability and diversity and productivity and welfare. But with human health, it's often shown the best question to ask somebody to decide if they're healthy is, how do you feel? And if you ask them how they answer that, it's the coherence between their lived reality and their hopes. So that was an important understanding for me to think about. If I'm interested in all the things that affect the thing I'm interested in health, I have to think about what I meant by health. So around this time, I'm working in human public health and tons of emergent diseases. This was sort of when I first did this, I was discouraged from doing a degree in infectious diseases because, we sort of won the battle. Then HIV was popping up around there. And then we're getting more emerging diseases around the world, more emerging zoonoses. And I was dealing with a lot of these in human public health. And one day I was walking back from the coffee shop with a sticky bun and a cup of coffee with a colleague of mine who was a physician. And he said to me, Craig, I know it's your job to look after the health of animals. I know it's my job to look after the health of people. We both kind of think about how the environment affects that, but whose job is it to pull it all together? So well, it's nobody's job to do. He said, why don't you? Me, I thought, well, why not? So I started with a practice. Today, you'd call it a One Health practice. Back then, it was the Center for Coastal Health, where we try to look at these things that are the interface of people, animals, and the environment. Nobody ever called it One Health. What they did is they had complex problems that had multiple drivers and determinants, and they wanted somebody to start to help them deal with the mess. And I began to learn very quickly there with these things with multiple partners, with multiple values and multiple issues. The most important thing I could ask is, how can I help? Not what is the truth. And it was really important to recognize that problem-solving approach was much more efficient at building multi-sectoral collaborations than, I've got a grant to understand this disease, help me get my samples. How can I help? It was so important. And when I recognized that I could help more by moving towards root causes and create multi-solving. So by helping this person with their problem, it also helps them with theirs, which gets them working together better. And now we move forward. And that was really important to get groups working together to try to make things better. In doing so, I had a very important insight. And that insight was the fact the causes of the causes of the causes is almost always a human decision. That if I really wanted to try to have human, animal, environmental health, I fundamentally had to become a sociologist. Data do not help people change. Understanding what drives decisions was really important. That linked up to lesson number 5. Evidence is not enough, and evidence is not just science. Rightfully or wrongfully, I agreed to go on a whole bunch of environmental impact assessments, and this fellow here was the judge running one of the biggest public inquiries in Canadian history into the environmental impacts of salmon farms. I spent 3 days in front of 16 lawyers testifying about some of the health issues around here. And I mean, this was a thing where people were getting death threats about this issue, so it was a stressful sort of day. So I didn't necessarily enjoy it, but I learned a lot. And the most important thing I learned is that I was so narrow in what I thought was evidence in my training. I used to think I'm an epidemiologist, we're broad thinking. We think about all these different risk factors and interactions, but I realized I have only one way of thinking what evidence is. And one of the examples for that was during one of these environmental impact assessments, I got a phone call from the people from the office that's running the assessment. And they said, oh, Craig, you might be in trouble. I said, well, what do you mean? The NGOs are mad at you. Oh, God, what's wrong? Again, remember, this is an era, this is death threat sort of tensions. They said they want a special meeting. Okay, I'll have a special meeting. I said, well, what's the problem? They said, well, you've said in your document, there is no evidence that salmon farms are increasing disease in wild species. I said, yeah, that's what the literature shows us. I went through Evans' postulates of causation. None of it could be fulfilled. I went through all my science reasons why. And they said, yeah, but Billy Proctor saw it. And I thought, oh. Your first instinct is, well, who cares if Billy Proctor saw that? But I recognize that people, with that one, was this insight that people think about evidence differently. And Billy Proctor's not wrong. He saw something. And when I explained to them, what I actually found was I had these causations things, and there's no evidence in the literature that shows us. I wasn't saying it didn't happen, but I didn't know how to communicate that. I didn't realize that values and laws and egos and politics and power and trust and relationships are as or more important than any science I could produce if I wanted to help it make it easier for people to make good decisions that promoted the health for all. Just one side story for this. When I was going to go testify to this guy I'm showing you here, the day I was testifying, there was 3 other government people. So they had this session brief a week before. I said, okay, look, we're talking to the government people first. What we're going to do is we're going to pick you up in a seaplane on this day. Don't tell anybody what time you're getting on the seaplane. And we're going to take you here and land here. Don't tell anybody when you're landing. We'll take you to this hotel, which you shouldn't tell anybody where you're staying. We will pick you up in the morning at the back door. We'll take you to this thing with a bodyguard, and you'll go. We'll take you to the room. On the breaks, if you have to go to the bathroom, don't leave the room without the bodyguard. And then at the end, we'll take you home. And I went, what about me? They went, you'll be fine. So, again, risk assessments are varying. Anyways, lessons. This took me to the lesson about evidence-based decision-making is not just about the best available research evidence. It's about understanding the context, right? Taking me back to that salmon farm where I had to dive in. I had to understand the social context, the environmental context, the cultural context. I had to appreciate experiential evidence, whether that's formal evidence like you might have from a practitioner or whether it's personal experience. These are all important to take into consideration, and within the understanding of the environmental context, the decisions have to be made. That was such a huge decision for me because we still believe I have a paper in Nature, therefore people will change. But that's not how it works in real life. And if we look at what we're doing, we have to ask, even if we're talking about evidence, are we getting the right evidence? So we'll look on the left there. This is a recent scoping review we did looking at literature on climate change adaptation and animal health. So we found 1,341 studies that talked about climate change adaptation and animal health. 1,305 of them simply described what could go wrong in great detail, but didn't actually talk about doing something. Only 36 of those papers said we should do something. We should actually do something for adaptation. Of those, almost half of them just said, well, species with high levels of generalized lifestyles, they'll be okay. None of them said, well, we should modify, like put fans in dairy barns, and 6 talk about animal husbandry. None of them were evaluated to see if those recommendations would work. They're just the ideas of the researcher. Similarly, years before, we did a review of almost 500 papers in 3 journals that reported on fish and wildlife diseases. You see that at the very bottom, only 4% of the papers actually try to look at doing something for animals under the conditions they live. Most of it was describing what could go wrong in more and more and more detail. So even the evidence we're producing is not leading to solutions. And I recognize something even more important, that we don't spend as much time trying to make evidence useful. Again, like I said, putting a paper in a journal is really good for your peers, but not necessarily helping change happen, right? Evidence is useless if it's not used. And there's huge gaps between these great intentions and lived reality on the ground. We're not making the best use of what we know already. If I was king of the world, I would stop any new discovery research for 10 years and just focus on integrating what we know across species and closing that gap between knowing and doing, because that gap's getting bigger. And I learned the importance of advocacy and knowledge brokering. Okay, when I went through my PhD, advocacy, science doesn't do, you don't do advocacy, you just give them the truth and people act on it. No, you have to have people, you have to help them to understand what that truth is. You have to understand how it affects them. You have to effectively broker your knowledge into change to create those positive changes that happen. And we suck at that. And we need to get better at that. Now, okay, by this time, sort of on my made-up timeline, the Center for Coastal Health, I'm doing lots of global health stuff now. So you got a picture of a pig in Nepal. We were looking at Japanese encephalitis in itinerant farmers, the peri-urban areas. We're doing avian influenza policy in China. We're looking at a human-primate interaction in Asia and in the Caribbean and the potential for community health. We're looking at things like post-tsunami and post-war recovery and economic development and food security through aquaculture in Sri Lanka, all sorts of fun projects like that. What I learned there is all health is local, just like all diseases are local. Yeah, there's general things that we can share, but at the end of the day, the local context matters. That might be the social context, that might be the reality of the farms, that might be the temperatures, that might be the animals. That each little local thing's its own natural experiment, complex dynamic system. And that means truth is context specific. And this was really hard. And this is where I learned to be a pragmatist in truth. In other words, truth is what is accepted to be reputable, useful, and helpful, as opposed to how Plato thought there's a universal truth, right? And I reckon as I go to some places, my truth may not be the same as yours, and that's okay. And that came up when I was in China, we do the Avian Influenza, where our colleague said, Craig, back in the day, we used to ask, people from North America come and teach us and help us. But we've moved past that now. And, in Asia, we think about these problems differently than you do in North America. And maybe we can learn from each other. And nothing more true has been said. Right? People have different understandings of how to interpret the world within their context and make their truth. The key is not to win them over to my truth. The key is to find the shared thing that we can do something together to make positive change. And getting stuck in debates about who's right tends not to be helpful. All right, lesson 7. I've written lots of books about One Health, lots of papers at One Health. I'm getting more and more disappointed in it. So my career, I've gone through sustainability, sustainable development, ecosystem health, eco-health, conservation medicine, One Health, global health, planetary health. All very similar. Trying to look at these interactions, things like this. When One Health came along, I thought, excellent, look at human, animal, and environmental health equally. But we don't. You can't say we're doing that when we're willing to kill millions of birds to prevent people from getting sick. That's not looking after human, animal, environmental health equitably, right? What it would really mean is recognizing that the actions we take to protect the health of one species today shouldn't compromise the ability of other species or other generations to meet their needs. We need interspecies and intergenerational health equity. Now, we have to deal with things like avian influenza and ecology of problem. That's classic veterinary public health and infectious disease ecology. That's what 80% of One Health is. And we needed investment in that, don't get me wrong. But I had hoped we'd actually have one that talked about trying to keep them equitably together and not always put the health of others at risk if it benefited people. Lesson 8. Kristen sort of implied this when I started, or when she introduced me. I've made a career of stealing other people's ideas and being thanked for it in the end. Every good idea I've had has been stolen from somewhere else and adapted to that local need. And why I bring that up as important is because, that's what good interdisciplinarity is. It's learning from each other and seeing what can be helpful for what you do. But that's getting harder to do. In the world where you go to PubMed or Google or whatever, and you put in keywords, and because of your search history, the algorithm selects certain papers for you, your probability of finding something unusual is decreasing. The advantage of being an old fart like me is back in the day when you had wanted to find something, you had to walk up to the library, grab a physical book called Index Medicus, look for that thing there in the topic. They would name the journals where that topic keywords might be, and then you'd look for that paper, and then you walk up to the stats, and you get the journal, and you look for that article. And in doing so, always the best ideas were the one above or below the one I was looking for that I never would have looked for. Reading law, reading public health, reading military intelligence, reading sociology, philosophy. Those are really important to become a thinking professional. And we need, if we believe that business as usual isn't enough, you have to think unusually. You have to open yourself up to find different things. So those are my sort of 8 lessons I want to talk. So how do we become future ready? What do we have to do as educators and as people? Well, when I read about future readiness, whether it's in business or government, 4 things keep coming up: inclusion, anticipation, reflexiveness, and responsiveness. We could become more inclusive if we thought about the one in One Health as one shared setting. There never is one health. There's always many in any place you go. In that room right now, there's many different types of health right now because you all have individual experiences. The rats living in the basement or in the walls, the birds are outside within your setting, there's always multiple overlapping populations. And until we start thinking about how we make that setting healthy for all, we will never meet the ideal of One Health. So we need to start thinking about multi-solving. How can I help multiple? You need to take care of the populations. How do you empower them to access what they need to stay well? How do you advocate for those who are being ignored? Drives me crazy in veterinary medicine. We are supposed to be the guardians of animal health. And I don't hear us routinely advocating for animals in many One Health situations. I don't see anybody saying, let's do a One Health approach to an animal health problem. We have to be vocal advocates for that. Just as our public health advocates have to be important for humans. And we need environmentalists. And we need us all together. But we can't leave any of them behind. Same with the places. We have to sustain places that give those things we need to stay well. Food security, water security, physical security, resources for coping capacity, and enable sustained access to that. And we have to be able to mediate goals and participate with others to find shared pathways for action. That will make us more inclusive. We'll be able to anticipate better if we think about health in terms of its determinants of health. So health is a cumulative effect of all the different things that we need. Remember, all the things that affect the things I'm interested in. Here's a model of determinants of health we made for wildlife. I mean, wildlife need these things to be healthy. They need the needs for daily living met. They have to have a proper social environment, how they interact with other species, how they interact with their own species. Their abiotic environment has to be suitable to what they need. Climate and pollutants, biological endowment, the physiology, the diseases, the genetics, how we affect the direct mortality. How much are we going to hunt? How much are we going to fish? Trauma. I mean, cats. Get cats out of there. We're killing billions of birds, right? Human expectations, the culture, our policy, our social norms. If we look beyond the pathophysiology of the disease to the determinants of health, we will see things earlier. We'll see signals of change. We'll shift from surveillance to intelligence. We'll shift from reaction to proaction. But we can't do that if we look at health through our narrow disciplinary lens. We have to think about it broadly and cooperatively and collaboratively. That means we have to become more reflexive. We have to think about how does your training affect the way you think of the problem? Because the way you think of a problem can affect the way you think of solutions. If you use everything you know to fix a problem now, you're already limiting your options because you're using what you know. So how do we break the status quo? By looking at how do my beliefs and judgments and practice reinforce that status quo? How open am I to other ways of knowing? Responsiveness, right? The quality of reacting quickly and positively. There's a lot of money that wants quick reaction, but health isn't quick. Health takes time to build and protect. So we need to focus on building the positive assets that keep us well as attacking the harms. So these are the causes of the causes. This is why we talk about protecting biodiversity, protecting wetlands, protecting social integrity in communities, right? We can respond to the setting's health needs by looking at these upstream drivers. The sad thing is they're not often the focus for calls for funding. Remember in British Columbia here right now, our Ministry of Health's budget is about 94% acute care. That means 6% for public health, and even less for health promotion that looks at these really upstream things. But I'll tell you this, you might not be the big star at your university or institution. If you're not getting the big grants, look at the big thing, but you will be more helpful if you look at these causes of the causes that protect the things that stay well. And I need less big stars and more micro warriors who even in your own personal life, your practice, whatever you do, you're thinking of ways to deal with the causes that were found in our relationships with the world around us. This is next. I always like this quote from Einstein. I have no special talents. I'm only passionately curious. And it sort of describes my career track. It's important to think and be curious. And curiosity is really important. This table is from a project we did many years ago looking at the nature of surprise. This is around emergent disease. There's very little published about surprise in the health sciences. But there's 4 basic types. The first 2 were basically we didn't see it coming. They either eluded detection or we didn't see it as a signal. We're trying to figure out, we're looking, is a harm possible? You get better at that by becoming more curious. Broader situational awareness. What did you see? How did you see that? What does that mean to you? Different places, different disciplines, different, and you triangulate better. The other two types of surprises are ones that just unanticipated from complex systems or just previously inconceivable, right? When I went through vet school, there was no such thing as a prion. Couldn't have even conceived of that happening. In those situations, the question is, can the population deal with something that's coming along? The only way you deal with that is protect the causes of health, because that protects their capacities to stay resilient and resistant to the next inevitable surprise. Curiosity and upstream causes of causes are the future ready strategies. We must disrupt the status quo. And there's three things, remember, if you're going to do that. You do not have to be a big, fancy group. And this is important when we start to see the current attack on science right now. Things are going to get broken. But the literature will show us small teams tend to have more ideas and tend to be more disruptive than big teams. Because big teams get to be conservative. They have to protect their investment and the staff and all that money. And if you have a little middle management, you can be more innovative and disruptive. And I say that to you because that means you can do that. You don't have to be big part of somebody's lab somewhere. Small, fleet of foot teams are more disruptive. They're more disruptive if you mix up things too. Bring new people and ideas. You tend to be more original. You tend to have greater impact if you bring in different team members, particularly younger team members, because they bring in originality and it increases multidisciplinarity. And you need to be social. Beer and pizza, right? Get to know somebody, because you find that have teams members from multiple institutions that know each other tend to be more successful. And that if you have social ties, you tend to have more influence and outcomes. So you can be disruptive without having to be some big thing. There's just four things I want us to think about when we're training people for this. Future readiness tells us this. This isn't even just talking about health stuff. To be future ready, you have to recognize the independence of human and non-human systems. You have to shift from finding a solution to this problem to comprehensive problems, right? That's that multi-solving, back and back. You have to address your problem in several perspectives. Different ways people look at it will open up to different solutions. And that means you have to be good at sharing ideas and innovations and information. You have to work well with others. To get there, we have to have four ways that we encourage as we're training people. We have to train in critical thinking. A lot of our training doesn't do that anymore. We train people to pass exams and pass board exams. We have to encourage and support people to look at problems differently, not just pattern recognition, and not just what the prof says, and see how they can link knowledge across fields. That means they have to be curious, and we have to be supported for trying something different and bringing something different and failing and learning how to adapt from that. We have to create a commitment to doing, not just learning. So your job doesn't end when you publish the paper. You have to mobilize that knowledge to those who need to know to make the difference. And you have to train to disrupt. Using things in new situations and new ways and incorporating what others know into what you do. So in summary, right, we have our world that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's leading to brittleness, anxiety, unpredictability, incomprehension. We deal with volatility by building health, not remedying disease, building health. The capacity to meet the needs for daily living, cope with all the crap that life throws at you, and meet the expectations socially or ecologically assigned. We have to build resilience so they can deal with the next inevitable problem and have that as our purpose. To reduce uncertainty, we have to start to be more inclusive of our knowledge and transparent about how we know things and how we share things. Listen to Billy Proctor and advocate so people understand what you know and why it matters. For complexity, we have to use my made-up word, interproblementarity. We have to really recognize the interdependence of different problems and work upstream on those causes of the causes so we find shared solutions. And that's really going to come from increasing and supporting your curiosity. We're going to deal with ambiguity by working with other truths, not getting into a fight about who's right, but working together about how to close this gap between hoping to do good things and really being clear on what we mean by success. on what I know for sure is waiting for the next disaster is not a future ready strategy. So I'll stop there and see if we have any questions. Thank you.
Craig, you mentioned the Wildlife Disease Association meeting coming up. Would you mind saying just a little blurb about that real quick to tell people what's happening?
Yeah, end of July in Victoria, British Columbia. It's going to be the annual Wildlife Disease Association meeting. That'll be an international meeting of folks who come to talk about latest science and understandings about wildlife diseases, usually. And this year, we're trying to create more spaces where there's dialogue so people can not just listen to lectures, but talk with each other to try to think about what could we do differently to move forward. And certainly those who are interested in wildlife, I would encourage you to travel up, and it's a great way to build your community and learn from others.
Thank you. And we're very fortunate because Marcy is actually past president of the WDA, so we're lucky to have her next. Do we have time for questions, Steve?
Yeah, we have time for 2 or 3 questions. So if you're going to ask a question, raise your hand and then try and push the microphone button so that it gets recorded. Any questions for Dr. Stephen? Oh, I'll throw one. Oh, go ahead, Carmen.
Hi, Craig. That was a great talk. Thanks for giving that. Near the end, you had talked about kind of inconceivable surprises. You mentioned prion diseases. I guess I struggle to understand, how I guess it's also the solution to that also feels inconceivable to me. So how do you know, or how do you suggest that, building resiliency will help prevent or, mitigate the impact of an inconceivable surprise? If that question makes sense.
No, it does make sense. And I think the only way I can answer that is to deal with the inconceivable, you have to ensure the population has options. Because if we don't know which way it's going to get hit, we don't know which way it's going to have to react. And many of our options for animals and people come from being healthy. Your capacity to respond to something bad is limited when you are food insecure, when you have no shelter, when you've already got 6 other diseases that you're dealing with, right? And so if we try to minimize those and make sure they have access to what they need to stay well, you create more options. I mean, that's why biodiversity is important, right? Biodiversity gives options because that one might be better than this one situation. And so that, I mean, really, Carmen, that was one of the things that drove me when I was working as an infectious disease epidemiologist, working on emergent diseases around the world. That's what drove me towards health. And it was like, what can I do here, particularly in low resource settings? In North America, we're so used to saying, well, the response to these things is, we'll build a lab, we'll get a vaccine, and we'll do this, that. But a lot of places don't have the money to do that, or the political will, or whatever. But the farmer's always happy if their cows are producing milk. The hunter's always happy if they can get what they want. Most people will get behind trying to keep things well. But we are so technologically focused that it's hard to invest in those fundamental basic things, right? So the Nepal Japanese encephalitis example, right? I could get paid to go and do money on this really interesting disease that might threaten North America, and nobody would pay to make sure people had fresh water and safe food, which was killing way more people than Japanese encephalitis because it just wasn't sexy to the funding agencies. But if I had built in that community those who were not getting sick from gastrointestinal disease, who weren't malnourished, they'd much more likely survive Japanese encephalitis if they got it than if they were further compromised. So building that fundamental coping capacity gives you options to not only resist it when it hits you, but to have resources to bounce back from it.
We have time for one more question, if there is one.
Thanks, Craig.
I actually have a question. So I'm curious, you said don't go with the status quo, be a disruptor. And having been that person, how have you coped with that over the years personally? Thinking about all the young people that we have now and the pressures on you to kind of go with the status quo. How do you feel being out there talking about these theories that may not be the norm?
So I've totally recognized the fact that it's harder to take risks when you have huge student loans and a mortgage. I get that. But I also want to tell you that I did it. Being disruptive doesn't mean being an ass. Being disruptive means being helpful in a different way. Right? Breaking the status quo doesn't mean just criticizing. Breaking the status quo means helping people find another route. No, everybody will, you will be appreciated and paid if you're helpful. Right? And so I think that it's easy for us to get stuck in the status quo because it's safer. Grants are easier. But, I was able to get a career. I was able to get a full professor tenure. I was able to run without having to have the massive big grants. So the biggest thing you need to do if you want to be a disruptor is reframe what you think a successful career and a successful life is. If you're attached to the typical things of this tenure and that tenure and whatever, and this grant and this award, it'll be very different track if you say, no, I have an obligation to society to give back. As a white North American male educated in the Canadian system, I have every advantage given to me. And I believe in the social contract to pay back. So success for me is being helpful. And once you take that mind frame, you will have a successful career. Right? You may not be seen as the big person, right? Who gets all the invited to the international panels and all these sorts of things. But you'll be helpful. And I'll just say one last thing, Kirsten, about what I mean by that is so years ago I was on our volunteer fire department. And I was getting busier and busier, starting more travel, and I was in the back of the ambulance going to the hospital doing CPR and stuff. It's a half-hour ride into the hospital. And the ambulance people and, you're having a conversation. Somebody said to me, oh my God, you're going all around the world, and you're dealing with these diseases and you're having such a big impact. I'm so jealous. And I said, yeah, but my impact is very wide, but very narrow. So there's no bigger impact we could have on this person's life than successfully doing CPR right now. One's not better than the other. So understanding what you're trying to achieve and trying to make it better will help you have a fulfilling career. So that's how I deal with it, Kristen.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Well, let's give Dr. Stephen another hand.